The air in the sanctuary was a perfect sterile lie. It tasted of nothing, smelled of nothing, and held the precise temperature of sustained life without the messy inconvenience of comfort. It was the air of a specimen jar, and he, Omega Unit 734, was the specimen within. His breath fogged the cryoglass of his habitat's viewport, a transient stain of warmth on the cold, clinical surface. Outside, the common atrium bloomed in calculated perfection, genetically perfected flora that produced no pollen, no scent, no decay. They were green sculptures, monuments to a nature that had been tamed into submission, just like him. His own scent, the very essence of his biology, was a ghost in his veins, muted by the daily regimen of suppressants that dripped into his system while he slept. They kept him placid, manageable. They kept him blank. He was not a person. He was a resource, a vessel of potential, preserved and protected from the chaos of the world beyond the sanctuary's gleaming white walls. The director, Valeria, spoke of this protection with a voice like smoothed river stones, calm and inexorable. He spoke of the feral rogues in the wastes, of the instability of emotion, of the biological imperative that made omegas a precious, volatile commodity. Here there was order. Here there was peace. Here there was a slow, quiet death of the self, a hollowing out that left behind a beautiful, empty shell. Unit 734 traced the path of a nutrient line embedded in the atrium floor, a silver thread leading to the base of a towering ficus lyrata whose leaves were too glossy, too uniform to be truly alive. He pressed his palm to the glass, the pressure sensors in the wall no doubt logging the contact, the duration, the faint increase in his heart rate. Everything was data. His sighs were measured in decibels, his sleep patterns analyzed for deviance, his hormonal fluctuations graphed and archived. He was a living equation, and the sanctuary's purpose was to ensure he remained balanced. Beside him, Unit 219, Lyra shifted her weight. Her reflection was a pale echo next to his in the glass. She was a newer acquisition, her edges not yet sanded smooth by the relentless quiet. Fear still clung to her like a phantom scent the suppressants couldn't quite erase. "The excursion is today," she whispered, her voice a tiny violation of the prescribed silence. Her eyes were fixed on the armored guards patrolling the atrium's perimeter, their movements as precise and predictable as the light cycle. "Yes," he replied, his own voice a rustle of disuse. They were permitted these excursions once a cycle, a supervised tour of a reclaimed green zone, a carefully curated patch of wilderness designed to provide psychological enrichment without actual risk. It was another lie, a beautiful cage with a slightly larger floor plan. Yet his traitorous heart stuttered at the thought of it. The chance to feel air that had not been recycled a million times, to feel soil, however sanitized, beneath his regulation issue slippers. He remembered soil. The thought was a splinter, sharp and unwelcome. It came with a flash of memory, fragmented and visceral, the scent of wet earth after a storm, the press of rough bark against his cheek, a name being called on the wind. Elian. The name was a foreign country inside him. It did not belong to Unit 734. He pushed it down, back into the dark where such dangerous things lived. To remember was to deviate. To deviate was to require correction. Correction was a quiet room, a higher dose, a deeper blankness. "Are you afraid?" Lyra asked, her fingers pleating the fabric of her white tunic. He considered the question. Was he? Fear was an inefficient emotion. It spiked cortisol, disrupted homeostasis. The sanctuary had conditioned it out of him, replaced it with a dull, manageable anxiety. "The protocols are absolute," he said, the words a parroted comfort. "There is no danger." He believed it mostly. The sanctuary did not permit danger. It did not permit anything that could not be controlled. A soft chime echoed through the habitat. The light above his door shifted from white to a gentle blue. It was time. He stood, his movements fluid and economical, a study in compliance. He did not look at Lyra's reflection as he walked away, did not acknowledge the tremor in her hands. He moved toward the door, a silent, obedient specimen, ready for his carefully managed dose of the wild. But deep within the sterile chambers of his heart, the splinter of memory pulsed with a faint, rebellious warmth. The scent of rain, the texture of real, living wood, the sound of a name that was his and not his, a ghost haunting the perfect, empty house of his body. He was going outside, and a part of him, a part he was supposed to have forgotten, yearned for the cage to break. It was a foolish, dangerous thought, a bug in the system. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the recycled air that the system always purged its bugs. The transition from the sanctuary's sterile interior to the reclaimed green zone was a carefully managed assault on the senses. First came the airlock, a chamber of polished steel where gusts of ionized air scrubbed them of any lingering interior contaminants. Then the hiss of the outer door, and the air that rushed in was thick, humid, and alive. It smelled of chlorophyll and damp earth, of decomposition and growth, a chaotic perfume that made his head swim. The suppressants in his system fought to dull the input, to flatten the sensory spike into a manageable plateau, but they couldn't erase it entirely. It was like hearing a symphony through cotton wool. The melody was muffled, but the power of it, the sheer untamed vibration, still resonated in his bones. He took a breath, a real one, and the air felt heavy in his lungs, a weighted blanket of reality. They walked in a single silent file along a path of crushed, sterilized gravel. 2 guards in front, 2 behind. Their gleaming white armor was a stark intrusion against the riotous green of the forest. Director Valerius himself led the excursion, his presence a calming, authoritative weight. He pointed out various species of flora with the detached air of a museum curator. "This is Quercus robur," he said, his gloved hand hovering over the rough bark of an oak tree. "A resilient species. We have cultivated it here to study its adaptive properties." Valerius spoke of nature as he spoke of them, a thing to be studied, managed, and improved upon. Elian, he allowed the name to surface in the privacy of his mind, a secret indulgence, kept his eyes down, focused on the path. But his senses betrayed him. He could feel the varied texture of the ground through the thin soles of his slippers, the way the light dappled through the canopy overhead, painting shifting patterns on his white tunic. He could hear the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the chirp of a bird, sounds so alien they might as well have come from another world. This was life, raw and uncurulated. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. Lyra walked ahead of him, her shoulders rigid with tension. She kept her gaze fixed on the back of the guard in front of her, a willing prisoner clinging to the familiarity of her cage. Elian felt a pang of something, pity perhaps, or a strange sort of envy for her certainty. The first sign of disruption was not a sound, but a scent, a sharp coppery tang that sliced through the humid air. Blood. It was followed an instant later by a shout, cut brutally short. The guards' formation broke, their calm, precise movements dissolved into frantic urgency. An alarm blared from the wrist-com of the guard nearest Elian, a shrill, panicked shriek that tore the tranquil afternoon to shreds. Valerius's face, usually a mask of serene control, tightened. "Containment protocol, form a perimeter," he commanded, his voice sharp with a crackle of static. But there was no perimeter to form. They burst from the trees, figures cloaked in ragged browns and greens, moving with a desperate, feral energy. Rogues, the boogeymen from Valerius's lectures, made flesh. They were not the slavering monsters of his descriptions, but lean, hungry people with wild eyes and a scent of desperation that was almost as strong as the blood on their crude weapons. Chaos erupted. The guards' energy rifles fired bursts of searing blue light, but the rogues were fast, using the trees for cover, their movements unpredictable. One guard went down with a choked cry, a dark stain spreading across his white armor. Lyra screamed, a raw, piercing sound that was utterly out of place in their silent world. She stumbled, falling to the gravel path. Elian froze. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of light, sound, and scent. His programming screamed at him to be still, to be silent, to wait for instructions. Compliance is survival. But his body was locked in a primal terror that predated any conditioning. A rogue broke from the trees, his eyes zeroing in on Elian and the fallen Lyra. He was young, little more than a boy, his face smudged with dirt and fear. He held a sharpened pipe like a spear, and his gaze was fixed on the pristine white of their tunics, on the clear designation of Omega that marked them as prizes. The guard nearest them turned, raising his rifle, but another rogue slammed into him from the side, and the two went down in a tangle of limbs. Elian was exposed. He was a target. The young rogue started toward him, his movements hesitant but determined. Elian's mind went blank. The symphony of the forest had become a cacophony. The smell of blood, of sweat, of ozone from the rifle blasts, and underneath it all, the terrifying, unsuppressed scent of alpha and omega pheromones from the rogues, a chaotic mix of aggression and need. He was going to die, or worse. He was going to be taken, dragged into the very chaos Valerius had promised to protect him from. He saw the rogue's eyes, saw the flicker of something, not malice, but a desperate, bottomless hunger. The pipe came up, its sharpened tip glinting in the dappled sunlight. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, a final useless act of surrender. The world held its breath. Silence fell. Not the sterile silence of the sanctuary, but a sudden, shocking void where the cacophony had been. There was no impact, no pain. There was only a soft thud, like a heavy sack of grain falling to the earth. Elian forced his eyes open. The young rogue lay on the ground a few feet away, unconscious but seemingly unharmed. Standing over him was a figure that did not belong. He was not a guard in pristine white armor, nor a rogue in ragged scraps. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, functional clothing that seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with the frantic violence that had just occurred. The silence that surrounded him was not empty. It was a presence, a weight. He turned his head, and Elian's breath caught in his throat. The man was an alpha, his scent an undeniable force in the air. But it was nothing like the chaotic, needy scents of the rogues. It was clean and sharp, like cold mountain air, with an undercurrent of pine and wet stone. It was vast and controlled, a deep, resonant chord that seemed to calm the frantic static in Elian's own blood. It did not demand or threaten. It simply was. His face was stark, carved with a quiet intensity, and his eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on Elian. He held a short, dark blade in one hand, its edge clean, not a drop of blood on it. He had moved so fast, so precisely, that Elian hadn't even registered his intervention. He had neutralized the other rogues with the same silent, brutal efficiency. The brief, bloody skirmish was over. The Alpha took a step toward him. Elian flinched back, a conditioned response. He was an unknown variable, a danger, but the Alpha stopped, holding up a hand, palm open, in a gesture of peace. His gaze was unnerving. It wasn't the clinical, assessing gaze of the sanctuary staff, nor the hungry stare of the rogue. He looked at Elian as if he were seeing something more than a designation, more than a biological asset. He saw a person. The intensity of that look was more shocking than the violence that had preceded it. It stripped away the layers of conditioning, the years of being Unit 734, and touched something dormant and forgotten within him. The remaining sanctuary guards were regrouping, their voices sharp with alarm and confusion as they secured Valerius. They hadn't seen him clearly, this silent ghost who had ended the fight. He was a shadow, about to melt back into the trees. But before he did, he closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides. He knelt, not over the fallen rogue, but in front of Elian. His proximity was overwhelming. The clean, cold scent of him was a physical presence, wrapping around Elian and impossibly making him feel safe. He reached out a hand, not to grab or restrain, but slowly, deliberately. Elian watched, mesmerized as the gloved fingers came to rest gently on his trembling arm, a point of warmth and stability in the spinning chaos. The touch was grounding, a quiet anchor in a stormy sea. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes, held Elian's. They searched his face, not for data, but for something else, something human. Then he spoke. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that vibrated through the point of contact on Elian's arm. It was a voice that held no artifice, no gentle condescension like Valerius's. It was raw and real, and the words he spoke were not a command, not a threat, not a clinical assessment. They were a question so simple, so fundamental, it shattered the foundations of Elian's world. "What is your name?" The question echoed in the sudden quiet of the forest clearing. It was not directed at the designation etched onto the slim silver collar around his neck. The Alpha's gaze was fixed on his eyes, bypassing the label, searching for the person trapped behind it. Name. The word was an artifact from a buried civilization. In the sanctuary, he was O734, a string of numbers and a letter, a catalog entry. Names were inefficient, sentimental. They implied an identity beyond function, a history beyond the sterile present. They were a liability. For years he had not heard his own, not even in the privacy of his thoughts. It was a ghost, a thing he'd been trained to forget. But the Alpha's question was not a casual inquiry. It was a demand for truth, spoken with a quiet gravity that made it feel like the most important question in the universe. His scent, pine and cold stone, was a truth serum, cutting through the fog of suppressants and conditioning. It called to a part of him that was older and more fundamental than the sanctuary's programming. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, a woman's hand calloused and warm, tucking a strand of hair behind his ear. A voice whispering a name against his forehead in the dark. Elian. He opened his mouth, but only a choked sound came out. The guards were shouting now, their voices getting closer. The Alpha's grip on his arm was firm but not painful, a silent insistence. Tell me. His gray eyes were relentless. They held a strange, desperate sort of hope. As if the answer mattered. As if he mattered. His throat was tight, the muscles unaccustomed to forming these syllables. He swallowed, the sound loud in the charged silence. Elian. The name felt alien on his tongue, a key to a lock he'd forgotten existed. It was a whisper, fragile and cracked with disuse. But he said it. He gave it to this stranger. The Alpha's expression shifted. The fierce intensity softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by something that looked like relief, or perhaps recognition. He breathed the name back, his voice a low murmur, giving it a weight and reality it hadn't possessed in years. Elian. He said it not as a label, but as a statement of fact, an affirmation. He saw. He knew. In that single moment, with that single word, the Alpha had given him back a piece of his own soul. A shot of blue energy seared the air, striking the tree just behind the Alpha's head. He didn't flinch. His gaze lingered on Elian for one more heartbeat, a silent promise passing between them, a connection forged in chaos. Then He released Elian's arm. The loss of contact was a sudden, aching cold. With a speed that seemed to defy physics, he straightened and melted back into the dense undergrowth. He was there, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of pine and the echo of a name. "Unit 734, are you harmed?" A guard was suddenly kneeling in front of him, his voice tinny through his helmet speaker. He ran a scanner over Elian's body, the red light a sterile, intrusive caress. Another guard was helping a whimpering Lyra to her feet. Director Valerius was approaching, his face a mask of cold fury and calculated concern. The moment was over. The bubble of reality had burst, and the sanctuary's sterile order was rushing back in to fill the void. They pulled him to his feet. His legs felt unsteady. His mind was a maelstrom of conflicting data. The rogue's terrified eyes, the alpha's impossible calm, the searing blue of the energy blast, the warmth of a hand on his arm, and the sound of his own name, spoken by a stranger as if it meant everything. As they led him back toward the shimmering perimeter of the green zone, back toward the white walls and the silent halls, he felt a profound and terrifying shift within him. The splinter of memory was no longer a splinter. It was a seed. And in the chaotic, fertile ground of the last few minutes, it had begun to grow. He was 0734. He was a specimen. He was a balanced equation. But his name was Elian. And for the first time in a very long time, he was not entirely sure he wanted to be saved. The debriefing room was an exercise in sensory deprivation. The walls were a soft, matte gray that absorbed light and sound. The air was still and scentless. The chair was molded to the precise ergonomic specifications for a compliant Omega body, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply present. Director Valerius sat opposite him at a plain white table, his hands steepled beneath his chin. His face was, as always, a placid lake, but Elian could now see the cold, hard stones of calculation beneath the surface. He was not being cared for, he was being analyzed. The data from the incident was being collated, processed, and filed. "Unit 734, Valerius began, his voice the epitome of calm reason. Report your sensory and emotional experience during the security breach." It was not a question about his well-being, it was a request for a data upload. Elian recited the expected script. He spoke of the disorientation, the spike in his heart rate, the primal fear response as cataloged in his indoctrination manuals. He described the rogues in the terms Valerius had taught them: feral, disorganized, driven by base instinct. He edited the narrative, smoothing over the inconsistencies, omitting the terror in the young rogue's eyes. He curated his own trauma into an acceptable report, but when he came to the moment of his rescue, the words caught in his throat. How could he describe the silent alpha? How could he translate the scent of pine and stone into data? How could he explain the seismic impact of a simple question? "There was a third party," Elian said carefully, keeping his eyes fixed on the point where the table met the wall. "Unidentified, he neutralized the assailants." "An alpha," Valerius stated. It was not a question. His scent profile was significant, unsuppressed. The director's eyes narrowed slightly. "Describe your interaction with him." "There was no interaction," Elian lied, the falsehood a bitter stone in his mouth. He eliminated the threat and departed. The guards arrived moments after. He could feel his heart rate accelerating, a frantic drum against his ribs. The biomonitors woven into the fabric of his tunic would be reporting the anomaly. He was deviating. Valerius was silent for a long moment. He tapped a command into the surface of the table, and a holographic projection of Elian's vital signs shimmered in the air between them. A jagged red line spiked dramatically. The moment of the lie. The director's gaze shifted from the hologram to Elian's face. It was a look of profound paternal disappointment. Fear can corrupt memory, 734. It can create false narratives. The unidentified alpha made physical contact with you. He spoke to you. My question was not whether an interaction occurred, but for you to describe it. The lie had been pointless. They had seen everything. Every touch, every word, every stolen heartbeat was data on a server. The illusion of privacy was the sanctuary's cruelest joke. Elian's shoulders slumped in defeat. He steadied me all, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He asked a question. Indeed, Valerius said, his voice dangerously soft. He asked for your designation. Another lie. A test. Elian looked up, meeting the director's cool gray eyes for the first time. They were nothing like the Alpha's. The Alpha's eyes were a storm, deep and alive with untamed energy. Valerius's eyes were the calm, dead surface of a frozen sea. No, Elian said, the truth a small act of rebellion. He did not ask for my designation. He asked for my name. The admission hung in the silent room. Valerius's placid expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He deactivated the hologram with a flick of his wrist. Names are a relic of a chaotic past, 734. They are attachments, anchors to sentimentality and emotional instability. Here we have freed you from that burden. This individual attempted to infect you with that instability, a psychological attack, far more insidious than the physical one. He leaned forward slightly. Your suppressant regimen will be adjusted accordingly. We must ensure this contamination does not take root. The words were meant to be a comfort, a promise of restoration to his balanced, blank state. But they landed like a death sentence. Contamination. Was that what the Alpha had given him? The memory of his own name? The feeling for one brief, terrifying moment of being seen? They were going to take it away, flush it from his system with a higher dose of chemicals, bury the seed of Elian under another layer of sterile soil. A cold dread, far more potent than the fear he'd felt in the forest, coiled in his stomach. For the first time, he did not want the cure. He wanted the disease. Back in his habitat, the silence was different. It was no longer a peaceful emptiness, but a roaring void. The white walls seemed to press in on him. The scentless air felt thin and suffocating. He touched the silver collar around his neck. 0734, a brand. He looked at his reflection in the dark cryoglass. The face that stared back was pale and unfamiliar, the eyes wide with a new, frightening awareness. Who was he? Who was Elian? What had they taken from him when they had taken his name? That night, sleep did not bring the usual dreamless oblivion. The adjusted suppressant dose, delivered through the microports in his bedding, was heavier, a chemical blanket designed to smother his consciousness. But something fought against it, a flicker of defiance. As he drifted into the gray twilight of unconsciousness, he held on to the memory of the Alpha's voice. He repeated his name to himself, a silent mantra against the encroaching numbness. Elian, Elian, Elian. And in the deepest part of the night, he dreamed. It was not a memory, but something else. He was standing in a forest, but it was not the curated green zone. This place was wild, ancient. The trees were massive, their branches clawing at a sky full of unfamiliar stars. The air was cold and sharp, and it carried a scent. Pine and wet stone. He was not afraid. He turned, and though he could not see him, he knew he was not alone. A presence, calm and steady, was there with him in the darkness. A silent guardian. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. A deep, resonant feeling of belonging that he had never known. It was a dream of freedom, a dream of a world he didn't know existed. And as he woke to the soft, artificial dawn of the sanctuary, the feeling lingered, a phantom warmth in his chest. The suppressants had failed. The contamination was spreading. The seed was taking root. The days that followed the incident bled into one another, a seamless expanse of white walls and quiet routines. Yet everything had changed. The sanctuary, once a bastion of predictable peace, now felt like a prison in a way it never had before. Elian performed his duties, attended his enrichment sessions, and consumed his nutrient paste with the same outward compliance. But inside, a silent rebellion was brewing. He had become a spy in his own life, watching the watchers, searching for the cracks in the flawless facade of their control. He noticed the subtle flicker of the surveillance sensors, the almost imperceptible hum of the air recyclers, the way the guards' patrol routes were designed to eliminate all blind spots. The systems of control, once invisible, were now screamingly obvious. His dreams of the wild forest and the silent alpha continued, growing more vivid each night. They were his only escape, a secret world the sanctuary could not touch. In these dreams, he felt the phantom sensation of wind on his skin, the crunch of leaves underfoot. The alpha was always there, a felt presence rather than a visible one, his scent a comforting anchor in the dreamscape. It felt less like a dream and more like a connection, a resonance on a frequency he hadn't known he could perceive. He began to suspect it was more than just his own traumatized mind seeking solace. The alpha had touched him, spoken his name, and in doing so had forged a link that transcended walls and distance. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thought. During his designated time in the atrium, he started to deviate from his usual passive observation. He sought out the Ficus lyrata, the only plant large enough to offer a sliver of privacy from the omnipresent sensors. He would stand behind its unnaturally large leaves and access his data slate, a privilege granted for educational modules and approved media. But Elian was no longer interested in the sanctioned history of the consolidation or the biological diagrams of a neutralized omega cycle. He began to search, using fragmented keywords from the debriefing, rogue factions, unsuppressed populations, wastes, territories. He navigated the sanitized network, looking for a whisper of the man with eyes like a winter storm. Most of his searches led to dead ends or heavily redacted reports filled with propaganda. The rogues were painted as feral beasts, the unbound territories as lawless hellscapes, but Elian had seen the fear in the young rogue's eyes, the desperation. He had felt the controlled power of the alpha. The official narrative was another lie. He refined his search using more abstract terms: pine, stone, silent assault, rogue neutralizer. He was grasping at straws, but the dreams gave him hope. They told him the connection was real. One cycle, he found it. Buried in a subfile of a security breach report flagged for archival deletion was a single unredacted witness statement from a perimeter guard. It described a ghost, an operative who moved with preternatural speed and silence, who had single-handedly dismantled a rogue raiding party weeks before the incident in the Green Zone. The guard described the operative's scent profile, predominantly pinene and geosmin, pine and wet earth. The report referred to this phantom by a code name, a designation from the old military structure before the sanctuaries were established. Kale. The name felt right. It had the same hard, clean edges as the alpha himself. Elian said it aloud, a whisper lost in the rustle of the artificial leaves. Kale. The sound sent a shiver through him. Giving the alpha a name made him real, tangible. It transformed him from a phantom into a person, a destination. His search became more focused, more desperate. He cross-referenced the code name with old conscription records, with reports on anti-consolidation movements. He found scattered mentions of a group known as the Unbound, a rebel faction dedicated to freeing those interred in the sanctuaries and establishing a society where secondary genders were not controlled. They were dismissed by the consolidation as terrorists, but the fragments Elian found spoke of liberation, of a return to a more natural order. Kyle's name was whispered in these fragments like a legend. The increased dosage of suppressants was taking a toll. A constant low-level fatigue settled deep in his bones, and a persistent fog tried to cloud his thoughts. But the connection, the nightly dream visits to the wild forest, fought back. It was as if Cale's unsuppressed vitality was a beacon, a lighthouse cutting through the chemical haze and guiding him back to himself. He began to feel other things too, a faint, tingling warmth under his skin, a ghost of a scent trying to break free of its chemical prison. It was terrifying. If the sanctuary detected his biology reawakening, the consequences would be severe. Recalibration was the official term. A memory wipe. A complete reset of the specimen. He would lose everything. He would lose Elian. He would lose Cale. He was running out of time. He pushed his research further, taking more risks, slicing deeper into the network during the brief windows of opportunity he had. He found schematics of the sanctuary, patrol schedules, weaknesses in the surveillance grid. He didn't know why he was gathering this information, only that he had to. It was an instinct, a preparation for a future he couldn't yet imagine. One night, as he was tracing the sanctuary's power conduits on his slate, hiding behind the ficus tree, a new icon blinked into existence in the corner of his screen. It was a simple, stylized pine cone. It wasn't part of the sanctuary's OS, it was an intrusion. His blood ran cold. He was caught. He almost threw the slate, almost ran, but the icon just pulsed, gently waiting. With a trembling finger, he touched it. The screen went black. White text bloomed in the darkness, simple and stark. They took your name. Elian's breath hitched. They took more than that. A second line of text appeared below the first. It was a data packet, its title a string of numbers. His designation, O734. He pressed it. The file opened, and the sterile white walls of the atrium seemed to dissolve around him. It was his entire life, cataloged in cold black text. Biometric data, psychological evaluations, suppressant dosages, incident reports. He scrolled down, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrolled past years of blank, curated existence until he reached the beginning. Acquisition report. And under it, a single redacted line. Source of acquisition. But this file was different. The redaction flickered, and the black bar dissolved, revealing the text beneath. Source of acquisition. Unbound settlement. Azure Creek. Subject acquired during pacification operation. He wasn't from the system. He wasn't born in a sterile creche, a product of the Consolidation's breeding program. He was from outside. He was from the wild. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile this impossible truth with a lifetime of lies. The fragmented memories, the scent of rain, the feel of bark, were not fantasies. They were real. He scrolled further, his hand shaking so badly he could barely control the slate. He found the mission roster for the Azure Creek operation, a list of alpha operatives, and there, near the bottom of the list, was a designation that made the air leave his lungs in a rush. Operative A101. Codename Cale. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal, devastating force. Cale. The man who had looked at him with such intensity, who had asked for his name as if it were a sacred thing. He was the soldier who had taken him. He was the one who had dragged him from his world of wet earth and wild stars and delivered him to this white, silent cage. The connection, the dreams, the feeling of safety. It was all a lie, a cosmic joke. The man who was his savior was also his captor. The ghost in his dreams was the architect of his nightmare. The data slate felt impossibly heavy in his hands, a tombstone for a life he never got to live. He leaned his head against the cool, artificial bark of the ficus tree, and, for the first time since he was a small, terrified child, Elian wept. The revelation shattered him. It was a truth so vast and cruel that his mind struggled to contain it. Kyle, his silent rescuer, the anchor in his dreams, was the very reason he was here. The cognitive dissonance was a physical agony, a tearing in the fabric of his being. One part of him, the newly awakened alien, felt a white-hot surge of betrayal. The other part, the conditioned O-734, was simply lost. His entire reality had been a lie, and the one person who seemed to offer a glimpse of truth was the author of that lie. The data slate in his hands felt like a weapon, aimed at his own heart. He stumbled back to his habitat in a daze, the sanitized hallway seeming to warp and twist around him. He hid the slate under his thin mattress, the forbidden knowledge a pulsing radioactive presence in the sterile room. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the white wall, as the pieces of his fragmented past rearranged themselves into a horrifying mosaic. He remembered more now, a sudden flash of blue energy lights in the night, the smell of smoke, a woman, his mother, screaming his name, her voice choked with terror. And then a tall figure in dark armor kneeling in front of him where he hid among the roots of a great tree. The figure had removed his helmet. His eyes were gray, stormy even then, but they held not malice, but a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. He had been just a boy himself then, a conscripted soldier. Kyle. He had offered Elian a ration bar. He had spoken to him in a low, calming voice. He had been gentle. The memory was a paradox. How could the man who took everything from him have been so kind in the act of doing it? The betrayal warred with a deep, confusing sense of connection that refused to die. The dreams didn't stop. That night he was back in the wild forest, the scent of pine and stone wrapping around him. But this time, the dream was different. The comforting presence was tinged with a desperate, painful urgency. It felt like an apology. It felt like a plea. He woke with tears tracking paths through the sweat on his temples, his heart aching with an emotion too complex to name. His compliance began to fray at the edges. He was slower to respond to commands, his movements less precise. During a group nutrition session, he knocked over his tray of nutrient paste. The gray slop spread across the pure white floor, a messy organic stain on the sterile environment. It was an accident, but it felt like a deliberate act of vandalism. Lyra gasped, her eyes wide with fear for him. A supervisor droid glided over, its single red optic fixing on Elian. Unit 734, you have created a biohazard. Report for sanitation protocol. The droid's voice was flat, mechanical, but Elian heard Valerius's disappointment behind it. He was becoming a problem, a bug in the system that needed to be purged. He knew what was coming. Recalibration was the next logical step. They would see his emotional instability, his hormonal fluctuations as his body fought the suppressants, his deviation from the baseline, and they would correct him. They would wipe the slate clean. They would erase Kale. They would erase the forest. They would erase the pain and the betrayal, but they would also erase the hope, the tiny flickering flame of his own identity. They would kill Elian for good. The thought galvanized him. The grief and confusion coalesced into a single sharp point of resolve. He would not let them. He would not be erased. He spent the next cycle in a feverish state of activity, his mind racing. He retrieved the slate, his hand steady now. The information Kale had given him was not just a history of his pain, it was a map, a key. He memorized the sanctuary schematics, the guard patrol bot routes, the vulnerabilities in the power grid he had found. He studied the maintenance schedules for the air recycling system, the waste disposal chutes. He absorbed it all, turning his prison into a blueprint for escape. He didn't have a plan, not a real one. He just knew he had to be ready. Lyra found him in the atrium, his face illuminated by the glow of the slate. She approached cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. 734. What are you doing? They're watching you. Director Valerius. He said you are unwell. Her voice was a frightened whisper. Elian looked up from the schematics, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her flinch. My name is Elian, he said, the words clear and strong. Lyra's face crumpled. Don't say that, please. They'll hear you. They'll correct you for your own good. Is this good, Lyra? He asked, gesturing to the perfect, lifeless atrium. Is this living? It's safe, she hissed, tears welling in her eyes. Outside, there are monsters. The director protects us. He saw then the true depth of her conditioning. She was terrified of freedom, in love with her cage, and in her fear she was dangerous. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the desperate need to restore order, to prove her own compliance by reporting his deviance. She saw him as the contamination Valerius had spoken of, a sickness that threatened her fragile peace. He closed the slate, the connection to Kale's world vanishing. He was alone. The summons came the next morning, not via the soft chime of his habitat, but with the hard, uncompromising rap of knuckles on his door. 2 guards stood outside, their faces obscured by reflective visors. They were not the usual patrols. These were enforcers. 0734, by order of Director Valerius, you are to come with us for mandatory recalibration. The words were a death knell. This was it. Lyra had told them. Or perhaps his own vital signs had betrayed him too loudly. It didn't matter. Time was up. He looked past the guards, down the long white corridor. There was nowhere to run. A cold, quiet calm settled over him. He had 2 choices, walk passively to his own erasure or fight. He had no weapons, no strength to match the armored enforcers, but he had knowledge. He had the blueprint. As the guards reached for his arms, the lights in the corridor flickered, and then went out. The entire section was plunged into an unnerving absolute darkness. The emergency lighting, which should have kicked in instantly, failed to appear. A low guttural alarm began to sound, a deep rhythmic pulse that was not a standard sanctuary alert. It was an intrusion alarm, a full-scale system breach. In the darkness, Elian heard the guards fumbling with their equipment, their calm professionalism shattered by the unexpected chaos. He didn't hesitate. Using his mental map of the corridor, he dropped to the floor and scrambled away from them, his heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against his ribs. A voice, not from a speaker, but directly in his mind, sharp and clear, cut through the noise. The voice from his dreams. Elian. Move! Now. Kale was here. He wasn't just a ghost in the machine anymore. He was a storm at the gates. The assault on the sanctuary had begun. It was not just a rescue mission. It was an act of war. And Elian, the quiet, compliant specimen, was at the very heart of it. He was no longer running from the guards. He was running toward the chaos, toward the man who had both broken his life and offered him the chance to reclaim it. He was running toward an impossible, terrifying freedom. The sanctuary, a monument to absolute order, descended into a symphony of chaos. The rhythmic thrum of the intrusion alarm was a bass note beneath the high-pitched shriek of localized system failures. Red emergency strobes now sliced through the darkness, painting the white corridors in hellish pulsing tones of blood. The air, usually so still and sterile, was now thick with the smell of ozone from shorting circuits and something else, something acrid and sharp. Explosives. Distant shouts and the percussive blasts of energy weapons echoed through the halls. Kale's assault was not a subtle infiltration. It was a full frontal attack designed to shock the system into paralysis. Elian ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor. The knowledge from the data slate was a living map in his mind. He ignored the main corridors, the obvious paths the guards would take. He ducked into a maintenance passage, the air thick with the hum of machinery. He could hear the enforcers behind him, their heavy boots clanging on the metal grill floor, their voices sharp with commands. They were hunting him, but he was no longer just prey. Kyle's voice echoed in his mind, not with words, but with a sense of direction, a pull. This way, left, now down. It was an instinct, a compass needle pointing toward the heart of the storm. He found a ladder leading down to a lower sublevel, a place of conduits and humming power transformers he'd only seen on the schematics. He scrambled down, his hands raw on the cold metal. Below he could hear the distinct sound of a firefight, the sharp crack of the Unbound's projectile weapons against the high-energy sizzle of the guards' rifles. He was moving toward the breach point. He was moving toward Kale. As he emerged into a wider service tunnel, a guard patrol bot rounded the corner, its single red optic swiveling to fix on him. "Halt! Unidentified biological. Stand down for containment." Its weaponized manipulator's word charging up. Elian froze, trapped. But before the droid could fire, a panel in the ceiling above it crashed down. A figure in dark tactical gear dropped silently to the floor, landing in a crouch. Keel. He moved with the same impossible grace Elian remembered from the forest, a blur of dark motion. He drove a blade into the droid's primary optic sensor, and the machine went limp with a shower of sparks, collapsing in a heap. Kale straightened, turning to face him. In the hellish red light of the emergency strobes, his face was a mask of stark lines and shadows. His stormy eyes found Elian's, and for a moment the chaos of the battle faded into a muted roar. There was no time for words, no space for the 1,000 questions and accusations burning in Elian's chest. Kale simply nodded, a sharp, quick gesture of acknowledgement. He saw him. He was here for him. The betrayal still stung, a raw wound in Elian's soul, but the undeniable truth of Kale's presence, the sheer force of his will bent on this single purpose, was a tidal wave that swept all other thoughts aside. "We have to move," Kale said, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed Elian's arm, the same arm as before, his touch just as firm, just as grounding. He pulled him along, deeper into the bowels of the sanctuary. They moved through the chaos like ghosts, Kyle seeming to anticipate every patrol, every security checkpoint, navigating the guts of the facility as if he'd been born in them. Their flight was interrupted as they emerged into a junction near the central power core. Director Valerius stood there flanked by 2 of his elite enforcers. He was not armed. He held only a data slate, his face a mask of serene, disappointed calm. He looked utterly unfazed by the carnage erupting around him. A-101, Valerius said, his voice cutting through the din. He addressed Kyle by his old designation, a deliberate, calculated insult. Such a theatrical display, all this violence, all this chaos, for one damaged specimen. His gaze shifted to Elian, his eyes filled with a chillingly genuine pity. 734, look at what he offers you, fire and death. I offered you peace. I offered you safety. You offered him a cage, Kale countered, his voice a low growl. He pushed Elian slightly behind him, a protective stance that was pure instinct. A cage or a sanctuary? Valerius took a step forward, the guards tensing. The world outside is a brutal, unforgiving place, governed by the basest of instincts. Here he was free from that, free from the pain of choice, the burden of identity. I gave him a life of perfect, placid contentment. You stole his life, Elian heard himself shout, the words tearing from his own throat, raw with a decade of suppressed rage. You stole my name. Valerius smiled, a thin, cold expression. A name is a ghost, child. It haunts you. I exorcised your ghosts. He looked back at Kyle. You know this. You were one of us. You saw the chaos firsthand. You brought him to me because you knew he would suffer out there. In your heart, you knew I was right. The words were poison darts. aimed at the weakest point in Kale's armor. Elian could feel a flicker of doubt, a tremor of old guilt run through the man in front of him. This was Valerius's true weapon. Not a rifle, but ideology. He fought with words, with the twisting of truth until it resembled reason. "You're wrong," Kyle said, his voice tight. "I brought him here because I was a child following orders. I didn't understand what this place was. I spent every day since then understanding my mistake. I'm not correcting it. I'm atoning for it." "There is nothing to atone for," Valerius insisted, his voice rising with righteous fervor. "You are trading his perfect safety for a brutal, short life that will end in violence. Is that your atonement? To feed him to the wolves you claim to be fighting?" He held out a hand toward Elian. "Come back 734. We can undo this. We can restore your peace. The recalibration is ready. The unpleasantness can be forgotten. You can be whole again." The choice was laid bare before him, stark and absolute in the flashing red lights. A return to the silent, white, dreamless sleep of his existence as O-734. Or a step forward into the fire and chaos and terrifying uncertainty of being Elian. He looked at Valerius's outstretched hand, a promise of oblivion. Then he looked at Kale's back, a shield of tense muscle and fierce resolve. He remembered the feel of wet earth, the scent of pine, the stars in a dream. He remembered the weight of his own name. He stepped out from behind Kale, his heart a frantic drum. He met Valerius's gaze, and for the first time he did not feel fear. He felt only a vast, empty pity for the man who could not see the difference between a cage and a home. He turned and took Kale's hand. The contact was electric, a circuit completed, a silent answer, a declaration of allegiance. Kale's fingers tightened around his. He didn't look at Elian, but a wave of fierce, overwhelming relief flowed from him, a silent communication more profound than words. The choice was made. Valerius's face finally broke, the calm mask cracking to reveal the cold fury beneath. "So be it," he whispered. "You have chosen your extinction." He nodded to the enforcers. "Contain them." As the guards raised their rifles, Kyle moved, pulling Elian with him, and the world exploded into a final desperate battle for the future. The escape was a blur of motion and sensation. Kale was a force of nature, a whirlwind of precise violence that carved a path through the sanctuary's last lines of defense. He moved with Elian in tow, their joined hands an unbreakable link in the heart of the chaos. The corridors they fled through were a testament to the battle, scarred with blaster fire, littered with the smoking husks of patrol bots, and the still forms of guards and unbound fighters. The cost of this freedom was written in blood on the white walls. Elian's mind, accustomed to a lifetime of sensory deprivation, struggled to process the overload. The percussive blasts of explosives rattled his bones, the strobing lights burned after images onto his retinas, and the air was a thick, choking soup of smoke, ozone, and spilled blood. They finally burst through a shattered viewport in the outer wall and into the night, and the world that met him was a physical blow. The air. It was not the recycled, sterile nothing of the sanctuary, nor the curated, humid air of the green zone. It was real. It was cold and sharp and tasted of damp earth, of distant wood smoke, and of rain that had fallen an hour ago. It filled his lungs with a shocking, painful purity. He gasped, stumbling, his legs weak. He looked up, and for the first time in his conscious memory, he saw the sky. Not a projection on a ceiling, not a simulation in an enrichment module. The real, infinite, star-dusted sky. It was a terrifying, beautiful abyss, and the sight of it made his head spin. He fell to his knees on the wet ground. The texture of the mud and crushed leaves a shocking alien sensation against his skin. Kale knelt beside him, his hand leaving Elian's to rest on his shoulder, a steadying weight. "Breathe," he commanded softly. Just breathe. Your body is remembering. The fighting was still raging behind them, a dull roar now, but out here, in the darkness of the woods surrounding the sanctuary, an envelope of quiet was beginning to form. Other unbound fighters were melting into the trees, their mission complete. The extraction was successful. They traveled for what felt like hours, moving deeper into the forest, away from the burning glow of the besieged sanctuary. Kale supported him, half carrying him when his legs, accustomed to flat, sterile floors, failed on the uneven terrain. Elian's mind was a blank slate, wiped clean not by Valerius's machines, but by the sheer, overwhelming flood of reality. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, every hoot of a nocturnal bird was a revelation. His world had been a single, white, silent note for a decade. Now he was hearing the entire symphony at once, and it was deafening. They arrived at a hidden place, a cave concealed behind a waterfall whose roar masked any sound from within. The hideout was rough, primitive, lit by the warm, flickering glow of chemical lanterns. It smelled of damp stone, wood smoke, and the living sense of the dozen or so people gathered inside. It was messy, disorganized, chaotic. It was alive. A woman with a kind, weathered face and a shock of gray hair in her dark braid came forward, pressing a warm cup into Elian's trembling hands. It was a simple herbal tea, but the warmth and the fragrant steam felt like the most profound luxury he had ever known. After a time, when Elian's breathing had evened out and the world had stopped spinning so violently, Kale led him to a quieter alcove at the back of the cave. They sat on rough spun blankets, the sound of the waterfall a constant soothing presence. For a long moment, they were silent. The questions that had burned in Elian's chest had cooled to a dull ache. The betrayal was still there, a hard knot of pain, but it was complicated now by the visceral reality of his rescue. Finally, Kale spoke, his voice low and rough with an emotion Elian couldn't identify. "I was 16, he said, his gaze fixed on the stone wall opposite them. "Conscripted into the Consolidation Army. They told us the Unbound were terrorists, that they were hoarding resources, that they were exposing their children to danger. They told us the sanctuaries were places of safety and peace." He paused, swallowing hard. "When we raided Azure Creek, my orders were to secure any assets. That's what they called the Omega children, assets. I found you hiding. You were so small. You were crying, but you were trying so hard to be quiet." He finally turned to look at Elian, and his stormy eyes were filled with a profound ancient grief. "I followed my orders. I took you to the rendezvous point. I handed you over to Valerius. And the look in your eyes as they took you away. It broke me. It broke everything I thought I knew. I saw the truth of what they were doing. I saw the lie, and I saw my own part in it." He looked down at his hands. "I deserted that night. I found the Unbound, your people, and I swore I would spend the rest of my life trying to undo the damage I had done, starting with you." The confession was simple, unadorned. It wasn't an excuse. It was a statement of fact, atonement. The word echoed in the quiet space between them. Elian looked at this man, this alpha who was both his captor and his savior, and saw not a monster or a hero, but someone as scarred by the system as he was. The knot of betrayal in his chest began to loosen, not vanishing, but softening at the edges. "Why my name?" Elian asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "In the forest. Why did you ask for my name?" Kale's gaze was intense. "Because they take that first. Before they take your freedom, they take your identity. They turn you into a number. I needed to know if the boy I took was still in there. I needed to know if Elian still existed." He reached out, not to touch, but his hand hovered in the space between them. "And when you said it, It was the first time in 10 years I felt like my life had a purpose beyond just fighting. It was hope. In the warm, dim light of the cave, something new began to surface in Elian. His own scent, unsuppressed for the first time in a decade, was slowly, tentatively uncurling. It was faint, barely there, like the ghost of a fragrance. He could smell it himself, a hint of crushed lavender and something clean and fresh, like the air after a rainstorm. It was the scent of his own soul, finally breathing. Kyle's head tilted slightly, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. He could smell it too, but he didn't move closer. He didn't crowd him or react with the possessive instinct Valerius had always warned them about. Instead, he gave him space. He gave him respect. He gave him a choice. The future was a vast, terrifying unknown. It was a world of fighting and hiding, of running from a system that would never stop hunting them. It was a world of hardship and danger, but it was real, and it would be his. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of the cave, of the forest, of Kale, and of his own returning self. He looked at the man who had torn his world apart and then painstakingly pieced it back together, not as it was, but as it should be. And for the first time he felt the faint, fragile stirring of a new beginning. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not 0734. His name was Elian, and he was finally, impossibly free.